Hey everybody, this is Alexander Fitzgerald or Assassinato, and today we are going to be discussing bluffing strategies in online poker tournaments. Let's do some quizzes, see which ones of these you think are bluffs, see which ones of these you think are checks, or giving up opportunities. Let's get to work. So you raise 9-8 offsuit on the button, and the big blind calls you. The board comes 10-5-7. It's been checked to you. Check or bet? 5 seconds. All right, that's time. We decide to bet 2 big blinds into 7, 210 into 650. The turn is the 2 of diamonds. It's checked to you. Here, would you like to check or bet? 5 seconds. That is time. We decide to bet 810 into 1070. The big blind calls. The river is the ace of spades. It is checked to us. Here, would you like to check or bet? All right, that is time. If you did decide to bet, how much did you want to bet? We decide to bet 4,000 into 2,690 here. And our opponent folds. Well, this one we can go through very quickly. When a person check calls you on a board with flush draws and straight draws, especially many loose recreational tournament players, many of them would check raise or raise with their 2-pair sets are better to simultaneously get money from their hand and to protect their hand. So when they just check call, they often have just one weak pair. So when the board runs out very, very poorly for the majority of their pairs, and combination wise, what pair they have most of the time is a pair that shares a card with the board. When the board runs out very poorly for those pairs, you should keep firing. And a 10 or a 7 here did not want to see that flush draw come in and did not want to see that ace of spades on that river. So we continued to apply pressure. Let's try another one. We have 2 5 of diamonds. Somewhat of a loose player goes ahead and raises here. Would you like to fold, call, or raise? That is time. We decide to call here. The board comes queen 3-3. Check or bet? That's time. We check. And villain 439 goes ahead and fires 1080 into 2160 here. Would you like to fold, call, or raise? That is time. We decide to raise here to 3,360. And villain 439 folds. So the reason we're doing that, if we check raise about the size of the pot, that bet is a complete bluff, needs to work about 50% of the time. And our opponent here, if they're opening too many hands, has likely missed this board north of 50% of the time. So unless they're willing to call us down here with high cards, or unless they're willing to bluff again, we are very likely to get this bluff bet through, because most loose players, especially at low to mid stakes games, especially with recreational players, they open a little too much, they continuation bet a little too much. And the reason they do that is most of the time, nobody really tests them on that. So we go ahead and we check raise here because we could have some 3s in our range. It's a little less likely they have a 3 when they raise from that early of a position, but it wouldn't be inconceivable if we had 4-3 suited, 5-3 suited, 6-3 suited, something like that, and ace-3 off, something like that. We also could theoretically be check raising a queen for value, hard draws for value, although a lot of people in practice won't actually do that. But making it a bit more basic, a lot of the times this person just more than half the time has nothing and is not going to do anything about it. So we go ahead and do this check raise bluff. Here we have king 2 of diamonds, villain 13 raises. Villain 13 has been very loose. What would you like to do here with the king 2 of diamonds? All right, that is time. We do decide to raise to 8.71 big blinds. Villain 13 calls. The board comes king 6-6. It is checked to us. Here, would you like to check or bet? 5 seconds. That is time. We decide to check here. The turn is the 8 of spades. Villain 13 checks. Here, would you like to check or bet? That is time. We go ahead and bet 9.14 big blinds. And Villain 13 calls. The river is the 3 of spades. It's been checked to us here. Here, would you like to check or bet? That's time. We fire again, 12 big blinds. We checked on the flop versus a loose opponent in the hopes of getting them to bluff bet on the turn. When it didn't work, we decided to fire ourselves, but we 3-bet primarily, though this hand isn't good enough to cold call, but it works as a bluff because it does have a lot of equity. It does have enough equity to 3-bet bluff with. We would like to set up as many of our pots as possible with position, bigger pot, superior hands, heads up. But if we have to forfeit one of those, if we have half a hand, but we have position with a bigger pot, heads up, versus somebody who has just way too many hands and they're so likely to miss a lot of the time, that's a pretty good situation to set up. Now, in this particular situation, we did hit a very weak top pair. So we did decide to go ahead and try to get the person to bet into us. But when they didn't decide to do that, we did decide to go ahead and bet ourselves. We go ahead and go for a thin value bet on the river because when a flush draw misses, a lot of low to mid stakes players will say to themselves, well, maybe he has a missed flush draw. That's just a good enough excuse to call. So here we have 9-7 of hearts in the small blind. Here, would you like to fold, call, or raise? All right, that is time. We go ahead and raise here, and we get called by the big blind. The board comes king 2-8. Here, would you like to check or bet? All right, that is time. We fire 260 into 760. Big blind calls. The turn is the 5 of clubs. Here, would you like to check or bet? All right, that is time. Decide to fire 690. And he folds. This is a situation you should do a lot of double barreling on because on a big blind, the big blind player knows you raise a lot from the small blind. So they're going to call you a lot in the big blind. So they have a very wide range there. And they know you're going to be continuation betting the majority of the time on most flops. So they should float you with a lot of just random high cards and backdoors and whatnot. That means they still don't have much of anything on many turn cards. And if you fire again, a lot of times they'll go, all right, I guess you do have something. So those were all bluffs that were fun to explore. Let's tie it all together here. Bluffing strategies in online poker tournaments. Do you want to learn how to bluff more in online poker tournaments? Let's get to work. Try these strategies in your next session to gain more chips when you've been dealt absolutely nothing. When your opponent flats from the big blind, they are likely doing that with half the deck. No one wants to fold from the big blind. They're getting too big of a discount. It's too tempting to see the flop. What does this mean for you? This means your opponent is likely going to flop a high card or a mediocre pair. The majority of their flopping range doesn't want to see you betting multiple streets against them. Disappoint them. Let them see multiple shells. Let them see overbets. You should be especially willing to fire against them when they flat you on suited coordinated boards. If they call your small continuation bet on a board with a flush draw and straight draw, it is likely they only have pairs or draws. They likely would have raised their 2 pairs or sets to simultaneously get value from their hands and also protect them. When they just call you, it is far more likely they have one of their many awkward pairs. What they don't want to see from you is another huge bet. Disappoint them. No one wants to call huge bets out of position with awful pairs. Exploit that. You should also fire more when you have the nuts in your range, but they don't have the nuts in their range. A good example of that is when the flop comes ace, king, 3 rainbow. If ace, king, 3 rainbow. If they just called your raise out of the big blind, then it is unlikely they have aces, kings, and ace, king. However, you have all those hands in your range if you were the pre-flop raiser. Make them miserable with their mediocre pairs. Shell them with huge bets when you have this situation. This is another reason we might want to check raise a little bit more. Have you ever seen an opponent who likes to check back their mediocre pairs? They'll even do that sometimes with their top pairs. They are hoping for you to bluff on the turn and river. They don't want to bet their hands themselves because they're afraid of being raised. So going back to that earlier hand where we check raise from the big blind, if our opponent actually was going to check a number of mediocre pairs in that situation, that makes their continuation betting range even more likely to be premiums or just crap. And there's a lot more crap than there are premiums. Don't believe pot controllers when they bet. This kind of player leaves an exploitative opening. Let's say you're in the big blind and this player raises from the cutoff. You call from the big blind. You know your opponent likely has opened 25% of hands from the cutoff. The board comes king of spades, 7 of diamonds, 3 of diamonds. You check, your opponent bets small. Your opponent is screwed here. Their wide late position opening range has missed this flop the majority of the time. What's even worse for them is that they would check many of their weaker kings and some sevens. This makes their continuation betting range a bunch of garbage and some sets. Check raise this opponent sometime. You'll be amazed by how often they fold. Re-raise people who open too much. This is one of the most basic bluffs, but this guide wouldn't be complete without it. There are players in poker tournaments who constantly open hands they shouldn't. It's as if their job is to get involved out of position. You should exploit these players as much as possible. When they're opening their garbage suited gappers, you should constantly put them to the test. Re-raise in position and watch them squirm post-flop. Once they call you post-flop, they have indicated to you that they likely don't have premium hands. Many players would 4-bet their aces and kings in the hopes of winning a huge pot. Since you can eliminate a number of the bigger overpairs, that means you can continuation bluff the boards that aren't riddled with high cards. If your opponent does decide to defend versus you and calls on the flop, then you can check back the turn and take 2 more cards. If you catch up, then you'll have a huge pot in front of you. Your opponent is likely to call your value bet. So let's discuss this one just a little bit. So let's say you have somebody opening a little bit too much. You 3-bet them as a bluff and they call you pre-flop. They should on occasion do that with aces or kings, just so that's in their flatting range when they flat 3-bets, just to make that range a little bit stronger. They don't have to do it all the time, but they got to throw that in on occasion. But in a practice, a lot of people won't do that. So you can just rule out the really big overpairs when you 3-bet them and they just call you pre-flop versus many players. Now, on the flop, if they just check call you on some kind of coordinated board, that also lets you know it's pretty likely they don't have the bigger hands, because a lot of people would check raise with their 2 pairs in their sets to simultaneously get money from their hand and protect their hand if there were flush draws or straight draws out there. And if all else fails and if they just check call you on the flop, you're going to get 2 free cards, because a lot of the times they'll check the turn to you and you can just check and you can take your turn and river. And that is a lot of equity, man, just to add extra cards like that, which is another reason we want to be 3-betting in position. Continuing, double barrel frequent floaters versus basic opponents. Your continuation bets on the flop will usually get them to fold their high cards. However, there are certain situations where your opponents will not want to fold their high cards. One great example of this comes up when the board is very hit or miss. Let's say you open a 5-6 suited from the small blind or button. The big blind calls. The board comes king 2-2 rainbow. Your big blind opponent checks to you and you continuation bet. They call. This is a board where you should heavily consider double barreling. Whether your opponent is out of position or not doesn't matter. If they have a high card or backdoor draw, they're unlikely to go anywhere. They know on that board you either have a king or nothing. They're gambling on nothing. They also want to call because that's a more fun way to play. And to be fair, you raise from a later position with a wider range, so it's more likely you miss that board. If you're going to continuation bet this board, you should consider double barreling as well, especially if the turn card comes a blank. your opponent is likely to have nothing and will fold. They're far more likely to take the turn barrel seriously as opposed to the automatic flop bet. So unpacking this one just a bit, let's say you raise that 5-6 suited from the button, somebody calls you from the big blind, the board comes king 2-2, they check to you. A lot of people are just going to check call you there a lot of the time in the hopes that you'll check the turn and they can just fire river and pick it up a lot. Similarly, they'll do the same thing if you raise from the small blind. They're in the big blind, they're in position. They want to see if you can check that turn, and then they can just pick up the pot right there. On those boards where it's super hit or miss, and a lot of people do just want to call to see what you do on the turn, go ahead and fire a second bet. It's going to work a lot for you. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'll see you for the next one of these. Take care. Good luck to you if you're playing today.